week's episode of Tree Lady Talks, you'll be happy to know that I have emerged from the dock from last week's court session, which if you listened to it, you'll understand, but if you didn't, Julian Forbes led in. And another thing, I think there's been a bit of movement on that, hasn't there, Sharon?
Well, we had so much interest following this podcast. There will be a very short podcast where somebody is giving their right to reply.
A short podcast? What are we going to do? Come off after 20 seconds? How dare you sit down in the corner?
It's all about fairness and for people to express their views. So if anybody's listening to any of these podcasts and has a point of view and would like the opportunity to say so on air, just contact Noel at treeladytalks.co.uk.
And he'll decide whether he's going to let you on or not. So we'll keep you updated on that one. Anyway, this week, very, very interesting this week, with the news that the tree planting targets are, some would say, unrealistic. We asked the question in a sort of a roundabout way of Keith Sacre at Barcham Trees. Who's going to do it?
And where are the trees going to come from?
And where are they going to go?
Anyway, tell me about Keith.
Keith Sacre has over 30 years of experience in the nursery industry and was the lead author of the UK British Standard Trees From Nursery to Independence in the Landscape, published in 2014. Prior to working in the nursery industry, he spent several years managing and developing public open space in the local authority sector.
If you're feeling vulnerable or worried for your day, we know she interviews the best. From Santa Fe to Dungeness, from mental health to happiness, Tree Lady talks to you today.
Keith, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
I'm Arboriculture and Urban Forestry Director at Barcham Trees. I've been at Barcham for the best part of 20 years. Previously, I was at Notcuts Nurseries for 11 years. Prior to that, I managed the local authority direct labour force and was senior manager there for 5 years and came up through the tools and got into horticulture completely accidentally.
So many of us come into it accidentally.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
How long have you been at Barcham's?
Best part of 20 years now.
Just tell us a little bit about the nursery, the background and the scale of it.
Barcham Trees is the largest containerised tree nursery in Europe. We have capacity for about 150,000 trees on the nursery, from 10, 12 through to 25, 30s, 35, 40s. All the trees are grown in a patented white bag. There is a particular reason for that, which we can discuss. And the nursery grew from the vision of somebody called Peter Wells, then developed by Michael Glover and Warren Chatfield. I joined them 20 years ago, and we've built and developed the company in a range of ways over that time. It's been a real team effort, and it's a whole load of folk contributing in many different ways with many different ideas. Yeah, we're turning over close to £8 million, and we dispatch something like 60 to 70,000 trees across the UK each year.
Wow, that's incredible. Really good to have those facts and figures. And for those listening who aren't in the trade, as it were, those sort of sizes you gave, the sort of 8 to 10s and 10 to 12, that's centimetres in girth at 1 metre. So, and really we're talking about a tree that's 25 to 30 centimetres in girth. I mean, it can be upwards of sort of 7 metres tall, can't it?
Absolutely, dependent on species, sure.
Yeah, big old hefty tree. I think, my golden retriever's barking. He's gorgeous. Have you got a dog, Keith?
No.
All right. One of the reasons why so many people know Barcham's is that you open your doors to those in the industry just to come round and have a look and have tours, and also you have historically run seminars.
The idea was probably 10 years ago now. We were looking at ways in which we as a nursery could contribute more. We were very aware of a very narrow, we'll try to sell you trees. But we was a very early awareness that urban forestry, tree management, involved a whole load of other factors, and that one of the barriers was the relationship between research and the practitioner. And very often there's a blockage in that the latest research does not get out to practitioners. So we undertook the idea of, could we introduce a seminar series, and could we actually make research information and ideas freely available to the folk on the ground, the tree officers, the consultant, the tree manager, members of the public. So we started the series, and we've done over 75 of them now. And what we do is we actually give or invite a speaker or speakers to the nursery. We don't provide them with an agenda. They come to speak on their topic of interest. We don't ask or we don't insist on nursery tours or anything like that. And we've tried very hard to separate the factual part of the day from the selling process. So there is no selling that takes place while people are on the nursery at an educational seminar. In terms of the people we've got, well, we've had people from, if you include the Big Barn Conference, which we do every 3 years, and we were due to do one this year, but COVID intervened. We've had speakers from Australia, the USA, all throughout all parts of mainland Europe into Scandinavia. And we've tried to pick people whose work has been relevant and topical. For instance, Ed Gilman's spoken about tree root development and formative pruning. Gary Watson spoke about root development and tree establishment. We've had Ian Shears from Melbourne in Australia talking about urban forestry management, what they've done in Melbourne in terms of their development process, their strategy development. We've had Kathy Wolf over from Washington State talking about the social implications of tree planting, the benefits to be gained, the impacts on retail, health and well-being. So we try to encompass a really, really wide agenda. And we haven't neglected some of the characters and speakers. So Ted Green's spoken extensively on veteran trees on a number of occasions. Neville Fay has made contributions. So the list is endless, really. There's a PowerPoint prepared for, I think it was a talk in Australia, asking the question, are tree nurseries preparing for the urban forestry of the future? And it goes into elements like tree quality, but it also talks about what tree nurseries can contribute in terms of the educational process, leading development, taking part in national debate, and just generally widening the role beyond the purely commercial. I mean, obviously there is a commercial implication in any of this, but we've tried to keep the two separate. So there are no commercial strings attached directly to the educational content.
Well, I can say, as somebody who once spoke at one of your seminars and also attended many of them and the Big Barn, that it really is quite a separate matter. You know, it is a meeting of minds and a discussion and pushing the industry forward, which has been really great. And we can put that PowerPoint, it will be on our website, Sharon Hosegood Associates /Tree Lady Talks. I don't know an awful lot about nurseries, and I wonder if you could just take us from the journey from a seedling to the time that a tree, say a 10 to 12, arrives at a street in London.
So it all starts, as you say, with the seed, or one root starts with the seed. So seed production will be produce the small starter tree. So there's a differentiation. So you have whips and transplants, and whips and transplants are invariably seedling trees that are graded according to size and the number of times they're transplanted. So a 1+1 is a 1-year-old seedling that has been transplanted once. So then the development process continues. So you have the young plant. Once you have the young plant, you then begin its path of development. So there's two routes. Either the seedling can actually continue to grow, so the seedling becomes the mature tree, or the seedling is used as the understock for a named variety. So for instance, your seedling may be Silbus aucuparia, but budded onto Saul basalt cuparia, there will be Saul basalt cuparia shearwater seedling. And the reason that happens is that it's the nursery practice, and it's all about uniformity. It's all about evenness of crop, and it's producing an end product which is actually clearly recognisable as the type of product in demand, particularly for the urban situation, and what is popularly recognised as a tree. Whether that's correct or not, I'm not going to defend it, because they're also, but the popular conception of a tree is a certain shape and size. So that budding process is about uniformity. It's also about vigour, in that very often they produced on their own roots, Saul shearwater seedling would not be as vigorous as Saul shearwater seedling grafted onto Saul basalt cuparia. So I don't want to get too technical about it. So that's one route. That grafted plant or the seedling plant will then be grown on to the size that you would expect to be planted in a street tree. This is the grading 10, 12, 12, 14, 14, 16, as you've rightly described at a metre at the stem. That's that route. Also, material will be produced from cuttings. So, for instance, if we have a selection that is appeared on a plant, and the only way to reproduce that plant is to do it vegetatively, then you will take cuttings. So the cutting will be, as it says, a cutting from the parent plant, which will be rooted up on the nursery, then grown through the process to arrive again at the 12, 14, 14, 16 stage. There's a whole series of them production methods that you will come across. And I stress at this point, Barcham Trees is a containerised tree nursery. There will be several different routes or production systems you can buy into. Each of those production system works. Each has our advantages and disadvantages. And it's the familiarity with what's best practice with each of those production systems, which is crucial to the person that's buying trees. So Barcham specialised on containerised trees. Now, containerised trees are trees that are lifted from nursery field and put in a container for the final part of their production before they go to market.
So with containerised trees, how much root is pruned to put into the containers? What sort of size containers do they start off in?
They don't move from container to container, Sharon. Basically, there is root pruning that goes on at the stage between after field lifting and containerisation. The pruning of the roots is A, that they'll fit in the container, but B, we also take out any root deformities, any inward growing roots, any root breakages, anything that's going to be there. So we're looking to produce, to go in the container, the idealised root system with all the lateral roots extending out and probably with 4 or 5 of those present at any time. But when you look at the variability in root systems when you actually lift them to the ground, again, there is no perfect model. There is no root system that's identical. So that's what Barcham does. We put them in the container, then they stay in the container for 1 season or 2 seasons until they're sold. And there are problems associated with root development. I'm sure many of your listeners have looked at root girdling and the implications of root systems going and spiraling around the outside of the container. And so what we've introduced at Barcham is something called shelf life. So every tree is recorded when it goes into the container. That gives us a time period to sell it before we know that there's going to be root damage. Beyond that point, we actually cull the trees. And at Barcham, we cull something like anything between 3,000 and 7,000 trees every year, because we know they've gone beyond the point where we can satisfactorily say that the root system is in a condition to be planted. And there's a big pile at Barcham where you can actually, I spend a lot of my time climbing over it, looking for root deformities and just to build an understanding of root system development.
What soil do you use in a container?
At the moment, it's a peat bark mix with primarily bark plus a slow release fertiliser.
Mm-hmm.
We made a move a couple of years ago and we trialled extensively recycled green waste, which was fine when we were only trialling on small numbers. We then moved the whole crop over to green waste and quite quickly found that there's huge variability in the green waste product. And that caused us significant problems on the nursery in terms of root development. So we've now reverted to various formulations of peat bark.
It's interesting that you use a peat bark mix. How do you feel about using peat as a company?
As a company, we're not entirely comfortable with it, with the focus on sort of environmental management and climate change, and we're aware of the implications of peat use. At this moment in time, we're struggling to find a sensible alternative which actually reduces peat completely. So peat is an element of the compost mix, a small part. And we tried working with recycled green waste 3 or 4 years ago. And we found when doing trials, it was fine. But trials is a limited number of trees and only a small volume of the green waste product. What we found was when we moved up to cover the whole nursery, like all 60, 70,000 trees we were planting, that there was such huge variability in the green waste compost or the green waste mix we got that it caused the company enormous difficulties in terms of poor root development. So we had to revert to original mix. But we're constantly looking. I mean, over the years, we've played about with various formulations. We spent some time doing some research into was it possible to produce a container compost that didn't compact when you planted it. We've played with different materials in terms of water retention. So we've looked at pumice, we've looked at gravel, and they've all got limitations, either expense limitations, similar resource problems. So now if you're going to replace peat with another resource that is going to involve excavation, large travel miles to get it to the nursery, huge volume. So it's still, the jury's still out. It's like the white bag. The white bag's a method of production. Is the white bag ideal in terms of its environmental impact? Up until fairly recently, no. But it was, so we were faced with what we did about the white bag after planting. And it's now possible to recycle it. So as part of our environmental policy, we actually provide clients with the way they can recycle those white bags. That's a relatively recent, last 3 years or so. And we considered all sorts of things. Could we sensibly bring the bags back to the nursery and recycle them? Well, you can imagine that would be organisationally hugely difficult.
And actually have a big carbon footprint as well, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, of course. So, like all these things, we're constantly, as a nursery, looking for ways to improve environmental performance. And, I mean, we've just got ISO 14001, which has imposed a new set of disciplines on us.
Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. Production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed are entirely personal. So ISO 14001 is the environmental standard. Tell us why the white bags are special.
The reality, Sharon, is they're not. Here's the scenario. When Barcham was developing in the early stages, the challenge was to provide a tree with a root system that had the capability to survive when planted, particularly in the urban landscape. The methods at that time involved either bare root trees primarily or root ball trees where you get a soil ball. Soil balls are really heavy and difficult to manage, and bare root trees are vulnerable because of the handling process and the root system being exposed. So Peter Wells was looking for a method whereby there could be a reasonable amount of security in terms of the tree being in the best condition, or the root system being in the best condition possible for planting. So he found or discovered an Australian method where white bags were being used. And the white bag, the advantage was the compost doesn't heat up. And rather than deflecting the developing root as it hits the side of the container, it deflects the root system down. So the root system tends to go down as opposed to round. So that's the method that Barcham adopted. And it's become like a central thing because nobody else was doing trees in white bags. So Barcham Trees became readily identified. In terms of your other question, what's special about it? Well, it works and it has a track record of working, which many of the other systems don't. But the critical thing is, it's this mystery around root development. The white bag, the air pot, and any other container. And this goes right up to landscape scale. If you're putting trees in a 5-10 metre rectangle, then they're still containerised. And any container has a shelf life before there's root damage and root distortion, and trees will outgrow the container they're in. So the trick is it's the length of time in the container. And that's the bit that we've added on to the white bag. We actually will publish the length of time trees are in the container. So it's moving the tree from the container to the open ground at the right time. So we advise now that the outer centimetre of the container compost is actually scraped away, and the bottom centimetre at the base of the container is scraped away. A 45-litre container takes about a minute and a half to do with a spade. It's fairly brutal, but what it does, it takes any potential for roots to be going sideways or downwards out completely. You end up planting a completely outward-facing root system.
That answers it really, really well. And perhaps you can go on to say something about bare root plants and the pros and cons on root ball.
Bare root trees are trees lifted from the nursery field, either encased in a white bag or encased in loose soil for dispatch to the customer. But you're still working with a root system that's been lifted from the soil, and no matter how good the nursery practice is, at that point of lifting, there's damage to the tree roots. So the tree roots have to repair somewhere, so that will be after planting, which involves certain stress levels, as you can imagine. Lifted carefully, transported carefully, handled carefully, bare root trees are fine up to a certain size. So I personally wouldn't be too happy going beyond a 10, 12 centimetre girth tree, but that's a personal choice.
I'm the same. I mean, I think they're great for huge volume whip planting. Anything up to sort of 2 or 3 metres is brilliant. They're light, they're transportable. You know, volunteers can use them fairly easily once they understand they can't dry out. Whereas root balls are really heavy, aren't they?
With root ball production, I think the confusion arrives with the specification, because just specifying root balled is not enough, because there's a process to producing a root ball tree. So the root ball tree will be either lifted or undercut a number of times during its production. So, for instance, if you plant in a 10-12 in a nursery row to produce a 16-18, 18-20 semi-mature tree, that 10-12 tree will have been undercut, that's going underneath the root system and cutting it, or lifted and transplanted somewhere else. What happens at that time is there's root damage. Each of those wound points on the damaged root system will generate 2 or 3 growth. And then every time you do that, you get this enlargement of the number of growths. And if you look at a properly prepared root ball tree, and you look at just the root system, it looks like an inverted cauliflower, and it's a series of progressions. What you should end up with within your root ball is a fibrous root system that is very, very similar to a containerized root system. The mistake that is made is there's European, British, BS 8545 has got it clearly out. You can specify the number of times a tree should be transplanted, commensurate with the size of tree you want to purchase, and you can actually say what the dimensions of the root ball should look like. Unfortunately, that's rarely specified.
You've got a wonderful picture of that in one of your guides, which is the BS 8545.
Trees from Nursery to Independence in the Landscape.
That's it. And not only in that, but you've got your own Barcham's guide, which is a few pages long, which has got a brown front cover. It's A5.
Specification guide, yeah.
I recommend that listeners try and get a copy of that, because you've got a drawing in there of the cauliflower shape of the root ball looking at, and I remember that. It's so clearly explained, but as you say, I don't think that's widely understood.
It took me ages to draw it as well.
Did you draw that? It's really good.
I did all the drawings in BS8.
Did you?
In BS 8545 and the manuals, so...
Oh, I didn't know that about you.
No.
Then the trees have to be transported, and that's no easy job, is it? Because some trees are really heavy. Tell us about the mechanics of getting a tree from the nursery to the street in London, for example.
Well, basically, the trees are lifted, they're brought into the dispatch yard. At Barcham, they're manually loaded onto the lorries up to a certain size. Beyond that certain size, we lift them with a HIAB, and then they're strapped, they're wrapped, they're protected, and they're delivered to site and unloaded, usually in a storage depot, ready for transportation out to be planted into the primarily urban environment. We do a certain range of domestic planting ourselves, but that's very small scale at this moment in time. The handling is so important, irrespective of the production method you're buying into. The handling and movement of trees is critical.
Absolutely critical. I used to work for about 10 years as a director for another company, and there was a sister company which was a contractor's yard, literally in the same place, and I used to see these enormous trees being delivered, and some of the 35 centimetre girth plus trees, they came into a lorry. You know, they're enormous, and the equipment needed to move those trees, and I don't think that's always widely understood, where you have a large tree specified in a small space. You've got to think about how you're going to get that tree in. It's not going to go in your back garden if you haven't got room for vehicles.
I think it goes wider than that in these environmentally sensitive times, quite correctly. I mean, you may be aware of the Barcham carbon capture tag. So what we've done is we've commissioned Tree Economics to do a whole load of work for us, and we're now saying we've put a carbon grading on every tree species and cultivar in their catalogue. So you get an estimation of how much carbon those trees will store to the end of their life, or 300 years, whichever is the greater. So that started us thinking about other environmental aspects of our tree production, really. And as a result, we're phasing out the production of anything over 2025, and we're limiting the size of container we use. And the reason for that is the logic of planting a 40 centimetre cherry, where you're quite right, you'll probably get one or two trees on lorry. But the critical thing in it, Sharon, is that tree is probably a third through its useful life. So at the point of planting, if you're planting a 2025 cherry, that 2025 cherry is anything between 15 and 20 years old at the time you're planting it. Useful life expectancy of a cherry, 60, 70 years old. And colleague Mike Glover expresses it incredibly graphically in that he said, it's like investing all your money in a 50-year-old athlete in the hope that they're going to win the gold medal at the Olympics in 5 years' time. It's a false investment. It's not so true when you're dealing with long-lived species. So if you're planting oak, sequoia, where you could live for 600,000-700,000 years, then the investment may be worthwhile. But for the short-lived species, Malus, Sorbus, Prunus, I think it's really questionable. So what we said is we'll go up to a certain size with the short-lived species. We'll go 1 or 2 sizes higher with the longer-lived species, but we're actually going to pull out a production of the bigger 35, 40 centimetre girth trees completely. We'll just say, okay, we're not going to do that. If you want trees of those size, then you're going to have to go somewhere else. And this is all part of those environmental considerations. We couldn't justify it, Sharon. It didn't make sense.
And also, actually, the younger trees will catch up.
They will.
You know, the younger you plant a tree, the quicker it's going to catch up and establish itself naturally in the landscape. So often where I have specified tree planting schemes, I've done a mixture of whips, feathered trees and 10 to 12s. And then I'll go back 20 years' time, which I can do. Mm-hmm. And really, they've all caught up with each other. And I think the vogue for planting these very established trees, a sort of 35 to 40 centimetre girth, should really pass now because of those environmental reasons, of the transportation, if nothing else. The fact that it needs so much specialist aftercare as well.
Absolutely.
An intense period of watering, a lot of infrastructure to plant it and keep it stable, of monitoring. Actually, you know what? You can get a really good effect with some younger trees, some sort of 16 to 18s, 20 to 25s. So, I mean, I really share your point of view on that without even knowing the sort of science behind what you're saying. So, seems good to me.
Obviously, planting, street plantings, then there's a need to certain, so there has to be a resilience and
of course.
But there seems to be like a default position with many landscape architects, designers, that the default position is we've got to plant a 40 centimetre girth tree. It's just encouraging folk to question that and just say, well, why? Very often it's aesthetics. It's can I get the final design at handover to look like the drawings I've prepared for, rather than any realistic view of how long I've lost count of the number of sites I've visited where the tree planting has happened, there's been big trees planted, and the end result has been failure.
Yes, exactly. So anybody listening to this, open your mind or nag the designer into plant younger trees. Let's have more trees, if there's room, and planted at a younger size for probably less money. Have a bigger impact in the end. Now, tell us about the species that are being chosen. What are your best sellers at the moment?
Oh, the best sellers at Barcham haven't changed with maybe the addition of Amelanchier. They haven't changed in all the time I've been at Barcham. So,
well, that's depressing.
Well, it depends how you look at it, Sharon. I mean, in light of discussions about resilience and biosecurity, yes, maybe it is disappointing. I mean, I personally think from a huge palette and the work of Andy Hirons and TDAG in producing the species selection guide just gives a really good indication of the range of species available. I mean, the bees in my bonnet are Celtis, Coleroteria, Stiphnalobium, which is Sephora japonica, and having travelled extensively around Europe, each of those species is used really effectively in the street, but you rarely see them in the UK. Certainly, I live in Lewes, Sussex. I know of one Stiphnalobium. It's tucked away in the corner of a park somewhere, and I had to work really hard to find it. You start looking, I mean, the work of Ulrich Soman and Andy Hirons in particular would indicate that the species range is huge. So, but then if I'm a landscape architect or a designer and I'm working with a palette of trees that I know have been successful, it's a very difficult jump to make. And then I've heard stories where local authority planning officers have actually been the barrier to more diversity in that they have insisted that the architect's design uses a limited number of species, London plane being one of those, which is, because it's successful. But I think if we're going to take climate change, biosecurity seriously, in the urban area, we do need so-called exotic trees as opposed to natives. And we do need as wide a species diversity as we got. I mean, I've travelled extensively in the US and I've seen the impact of emerald ash borer. What really I found disturbing was a trip to Russia and a city called Voronezh. And Voronezh had just got emerald ash borer. And you could see the trees, the resilience in the upper canopy was dead. You then get extensive epicormic growth, soft growth around the base. And this was the stage these trees were at. As that epicormic growth thickens and woodens, then the borer gets in and the whole tree dies. But anyway, we're seeing it in its early stages and seeing avenues of trees affected. One species, ash, and seeing the impact of it and seeing the impact in the States where avenues of mature trees have gone and looking at those avenues before and after. And so the one in Russia, what really brought it home to me was I obviously knew how long it took me to fly from London to Moscow and then down to Voronezh. And that was like the London to Moscow flight was 4 hours, I think, 4 and a bit hours. What brought it home to me was standing in Voronezh, taking photographs of trees. I was passed by a lorry which had "from Preston" written all over it. So you don't need to be, you realise then how short the distance actually is and how vulnerable our own tree populations are. There's a lot of work being done through iTree, assessing the impact of different species. And I forget what it is now, but Asian longhorn beetle I think would take out 30% of London's tree population.
Well, all the more reason for people to really be imaginative, and think widely about species selection rather than because we're all under so much pressure at work, really the ease of choosing our old favourites, which clearly you're selling over and over again. Just out of interest, what's in the top 5 or just a few of the names? Birch,
hawthorn, cherry, mountain ash, amelanchier.
Calorie pear?
Yep, you're quite right. Hornbeam. And the thing to realise is that if we're talking about diversity, then there's genetic diversity to consider as well. So Pyrus chanticleer, for instance, each of those trees will be genetically identical. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. Doesn't mean to say they aren't really good urban trees.
They are a good urban tree, actually.
But what percentage of your total population does Pyrus chanticleer occupy? And if it moves beyond a certain point, then it's obviously going to decrease resilience, because if a pest affects one of them, it's going to affect all of them.
Interesting. I wonder what you can do as a nursery really to encourage a greater diversity. And I think I can answer my own question in that, your website, and same with other really good nurseries. Of course, there are many, many excellent tree nurseries in the UK. But the website, the clear information you provide to try and encourage landscape architects. And I say to any arboriculturalist listening, make sure you're involved with the design of the tree planting by having a chat with the landscape architect to broaden minds. But I wonder if we might change tack now. And in theory, you should be in heaven because of the government's targets for planting trees. Are you in heaven about it? or have you got some concerns, Keith?
For the first time, in my experience, it has suddenly become a seller's market in that our product is valued and it's becoming more valuable, which is great news. And I've absolutely no problem at all, because it's not going to resolve any of the environmental problems on its own, but it's a very, very useful tool for mitigation and will have a high impact on people and the places they live. But there's a but to it, Sharon. And the but is it's being done by numbers. So suddenly, from nowhere, we're going to increase canopy cover by 20% in 5 years. No, you're not. It's impossible. So I really don't want to appear to be being critical of the folks that are stimulating these policies or providing the funds to do them. It's all very positive. But I know of one London borough that was charged with planting an additional 5,000 street trees in 2 years. It doesn't say anything about species diversity. It doesn't say anything about locality. It doesn't say anything about management and maintenance. And what this was, there's very rarely a vision beyond the numbers. So what do we want our urban forest to deliver? There's a whole ream of things that it can deliver, as you're well aware. There's whole loads of societal benefits, public goods. Careful species selection would enable prioritisation of those public goods. Strategic placement of trees would facilitate development of those public goods. Consideration of species would deliver greater public goods. All of those things seem to be missing. Like very often they claim to increase canopy cover by 20% is coupled with the next question where you actually asked, what is your canopy cover now?
Exactly.
And they don't know.
Well, actually, spoiler alert, we've got a podcast next week by Tree Economics, which discusses that very thing about the importance of understanding what you've got. But nobody's really talking about where are you planting? Is the land available? If the land is available, is the best thing environmentally to plant trees there? Because there are some really scarce habitats which are being lost, such as heathland, meadows, remnant meadows, etc., where it's not appropriate to plant trees because that habitat has its own value. And the other question is, have we got enough trees in this country to meet those targets, Keith?
No, basically, because of the range of trees that we use and offer to our clients, there's no way we can grow that range in the UK. So we import a number of trees each year. And so we've got all the biosecurity protocols in place and the whole series of inspections. So we have no fear about biosecurity. What we do have a fear about, and I think everybody would need to be aware of this, there is a shortage of trees in Europe. The Chinese have taken 100,000 trees out of the Dutch market for the last 3 years because tree planting is a priority in China and Russia. So you have a huge demand on trees. It's not like making ball bearings where you put another machine in and you increase production. So as I discussed earlier, the stages in the process from seed to tree, that's a 5-7 year process. So if we were to put an additional 40,000 trees down at Barcham, if that was possible, they wouldn't be ready for another 5 to 7 years. And at which time, during that time, so here we come to nursery investment. In 5 to 7 years, the priorities may have changed. So those things we've invested in now to fill a market that exists now could be wasted when they come to fruition. And this has happened. This is like a cyclic thing with nursery production. It's getting nursery production to actually meet demand. And that's why it's so disappointing when none of the consultations, to my knowledge, in terms of the English tree strategy, in various other, the 25-year environmental plan, all of which made claims for trees. To my knowledge, and I guess I'm in a reasonable position to suggest that had consultation with nurseries taken in place, I might have been involved. To my knowledge, nurseries have not been consulted right the way through. How do we fuel this demand we're starting? There's just an assumption that the trees will be there.
So let's just get this straight, Keith. The government have made these policies. They've created the political targets for tree numbers. Nobody has thought about where these trees are going to come from.
To my knowledge, Sharon, no.
Wow. That, to me, shows a fundamental lack of understanding about the industry. Not just the nursery industry, but about the landscape and arboricultural industry as well. And I wonder, what can we do to change that? How can we enlighten the decision makers to think clearly and think about how things can actually be achieved. I'm trying to think of a parallel.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Nobody knows how many, let's call them standards and above, 810s and above, trees are imported into the UK. Nobody knows. It's lost in a huge mix, which includes all the whips and transplants. So nobody knows.
Really?
There's been lots of talk about encouraging UK nurseries to increase production. Well, at Barcham, if we wanted to put an additional 10,000 slots in, that slots is what the tree is standard against. It's like the place on the supermarket shelf that the tree sits. That would cost us the best part of £250,000 to put the infrastructure in. Now, is a nursery going to do that against demand, which is not guaranteed? That's the first question. The second is you look at the disproportionate restrictions around a disease like Zoella. So if there's an outbreak in Soham, which is 2.5 miles down the road from Barcham Trees, and that outbreak is validated beyond, we're in the zone then. Barcham Trees could literally have all shippage of any Zoella host stopped. We got no control of it. So if Mrs. Miggins brings a lavender back from Greece and it's got Zoella and it stimulates an outbreak, then we as a nursery, we couldn't transport them or ship them out. That's such a significant percentage of the crop that it would almost close Barcham Trees down. So against that background, would you be prepared to invest £250,000 in extended production? And it's not just Barcham, it's all nurseries. And you're quite right to point out also that there are lots of good nurseries in this country. It's not just Barcham Trees, and there's a place for them all. And most will produce very good quality stock. So, and they will have different production methods and they will do things perhaps in a different way. But that doesn't change the fact that they're producing good quality products. So while I will make the case for Barcham and have done for 20 years and will continue to do so, I hope I don't do that with prejudice against others, because I think it has to be recognised that we do have a very good nursery system in this country. So where that takes you, Sharon, you asked about tree planting numbers. Well, planning and long-term investment in the urban forest could be coupled with long-term investment in nursery stock. So Barcham and many other nurseries are then growing against a known demand. So it's almost suggesting, okay, contract growing. And that gives the nursery the security to invest. It also gives the nursery security to invest in different species because there's a demand. And a little example, I've been rattling on about Celtis, having seen it in as this Croatia, Berlin, Dresden, Barcelona, Stockholm, which is a fair range of environments, and seeing Celtis perform really well as a street tree. So we invested in Celtis because I was rattling on about it for, I think I'm right, I think it was 2 or 3 seasons. The Celtis crop we grew sat there and ended up being scrapped, other than 1 or 2 individuals, because nobody took it. That's changing now because people are becoming aware of Celtis and using Celtis. You mentioned the species range. There's got to be some incentive or some solidity in the marketplace to encourage nurseries to invest in trees that they're not sure will sell. Like Lagerstromia has taken an enormous amount of time to people to realise it's a really good, small street tree. Does extraordinarily well. I first saw it in Florida probably 20 years ago and came babbling back to Mike Glover at Barcham. We've got to be doing this one. But it's taken all that time to become an accepted part of the palette.
And unlike most fashion, you've got that time lag. It's not like this is this season's tree darling. You know, you've got to grow it for 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then try and sell it.
You take that analysis a little bit further, Sharon, and you ask the question about tree numbers, tree planting numbers. Okay, any land mass is going to have an amount of available space for planting. There'll be fresh space created as you get losses. But if we fill all that space now, the palette of trees we're going to be using is the palette of trees available now.
Oh, yes. They're going to say that was so 2021.
You've got it in one. And speaking to Dave Nowak, USDA Forestry Service, who's one of the designers of iTree, and Dave spoke about planting numbers. He said you create population bubbles. So what you do is you do this serious amount of planting in a short period of time. Much of it will be fashion. So if you think about cherry populations, for instance, in urban centres, it reflects a trend for cherries in the early 1950s, 60s, and you can see it.
You can definitely date a development. Going off tack, rather, something that's a real perennial problem, forgive the pun, in our industries is lack of people coming forward to work in it, to know it's a job. Is it the same with the nursery trade?
Yeah, undoubtedly. There is a distinct shortage of people who are interested in nursery work, growing plants, working with the soil, being outdoors. Yeah, it's a real problem. And one of many barriers, because I'm always rattling on at Barcham about going into propagation. And there's quite rightly resistance to that because it means doing production sequence that we don't currently do. But one of the barriers to that would be, where would we find the staff that could sensibly populate a new propagation? And the truth is, Sharon, we couldn't. It'd be really, really difficult. So the answer to this question, I know there's an awful lot of work going on with the all parliamentary group on horticulture. There's the work that the Arboriculture Association have contributed to that body of work. And I think they all identify this skill shortage and desire to work on the land, Sharon.
I'm optimistic that might change for two reasons. One is growing environmental awareness generally, particularly amongst the young. And the other is a lot of people have sadly lost their jobs in this time of COVID and time to retrain. So I frequently mention this in the podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, there is work out there, you know, in the outdoor green industries. So go on to, well, come to us first. We'll direct you. We'll signpost you to various websites. That's brilliant. Keith, I've taken up so much of your time. I could literally talk to you all day. But I just wonder, finally, in terms of nurseries, what is your dream scenario?
For nurseries to be seen as central to the urban forest debate discussion rather than peripherals that are consulted at the end. So as you'll see, if you look at the PowerPoint that I'm sending you, and if your listeners look at the PowerPoint that's coming out on your website, I think when you look at the range of people that the nursery industry is in contact with, it encompasses pretty much all those that are involved in urban forestry management. We talk to them all at one stage or another. Plus we talk to members of the public. So the range of people coming through the nursery in one way puts us in an ideal position. I genuinely believe that nurseries ought to be aspiring to become central to the urban forest because that's where it all starts.
Why hasn't it ever been thought of by government? Keith, you're an inspiration, a fountain of knowledge, and I really look forward to seeing you at Barcham Trees, hopefully at a forthcoming Big Barn conference when it's safe to do so.
Likewise, Sharon. And thanks for the opportunity, and I hope it's been useful.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right, see you, Sharon. Okay, I'm going.
Hit the subscribe button to guarantee you don't miss an episode, and you can follow us on
Twitter at the Tree Lady 67,
Instagram, Tree Lady Talks,
Facebook, Sharon Hosgood Associates,
or send an email to noel@treeladytalks.co.uk.
Yeah, it's really interesting, but I mean, I think there's something wrong with our border controls, because people can walk in here with whatever they like, pretty much, and even if if it's not an indigenous species, it doesn't matter. They can walk in, they can, Mrs. Miggins can bring her ash in. That's not ash. And then, he can have emerald ash borer, and then Barchams can go bust overnight. There's definitely something wrong there. There's got to be something wrong there. You go to Australia, I mean, you can't even go in if you have anything at all which is non-native Australian.
We have all the rules and regulations. I just hope that things are properly resourced, because if we miss an Asian longhorn beetle in a wooden pallet, well, the devastation could be considerable.
I remember David Cole talking about that in episode 11 of Series 1, where we talked about putting Tide Pods in shipping containers. It was really interesting. So yeah, we can do it, we just don't.
We've got a whole back catalogue of other episodes, so if you've just discovered Tree Lady Talks, go to the website or your favourite podcast provider.
You want to talk about Arbor Day? I know we're doing an Arbor Day podcast.
Noel and I had the privilege of being involved with Arbor Day 2021, which of course was a virtual event this year on the 4th of February, and it links into the Worldwide Arbor Day Foundation. And we worked with Dr. Duncan Slater from Myerscough College, who works so hard planting a woodland called the Rainbow Triangle. He actually lost 4 stone in weight, and he really is a critical cog in all of the organisation, aided by the wonderful Marco Bartolini.
Oh, Marco Bartolini. He's got the best name in Arb.
Oh, he's definitely got the best name in Arb.
Oh, possibly from Sheridan Hollenby, who's probably got the most unpronounceable name in Arb.
No, Marco is a real star, and he encouraged Dan Snow to be a patron of Arbor Day UK. He's worked tirelessly with many arboretums as well and got some great speakers involved, and his daughter Sophia designed the logo, and you can see the logo and all the information on Arbor Day on the website arbordayuk.org.
Yeah, you don't know this actually, but I had a chat with Marco last night, and he said that I come around to your house and make you a pizza. And I said, if you come around to my house after lockdown's over and make me a pizza, I gotta buy you a beer. He liked it.
And there's plenty more things planned for 2022, which we hope will be a live event. And we're also very excited that this has started to ripple out beyond Myerscough, and really, really pleased to see that we have the Mersey Forest involved and many other organisations. So it's spreading. It's all about planting and celebrating trees on the 4th of February.
Next week, Treeconomics.
Yes, Treeconomics are a social enterprise based in the UK, the experts in the iTree suite of programmes. This is a multi-interview documentary style. This is a powerful tool creating a greater understanding of our urban forest and how we should manage it, where the gaps are, and how it can make a difference on the ground. And look out for the forthcoming podcast. We're going to be talking...
We haven't got any more time. We've got no one's got any headspace for the rest of it.
No, that's fine. Stop.
So
that.
nothing more to say really. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.